Okay.
I know it might be hypothetical because most people would be minimum, but are we telling you when we apply how much water we're using, or are you telling us how much water we're using based on some formula like it's 40 acres, or it's 20 acres, or it's 100 acres, or it's 30 cows? What if
Yeah.
we're conserving water by collecting rainwater, which hasn't even got in the ground
Totally.
yet, so you can't have it?
Yeah.
Using it for our drinking water.
So we're always asking the landowner, how much water do you use? Right? So a lot of times the landowner has a very good idea how much water they use. Sometimes landowners don't know how much water they use, and then they say, okay, well, can you help me figure this out? So there are some sort of averages. So a family of 4, we use 500 gallons per day, right? Every single Gulf island that I've been to uses less than that. They usually use about 70%. People subsidize through rainwater collection. Some people are just better at conserving water than others. So we always ask the landowner what they use. So in a couple slides I wanted to show you there is, oh no, it's at the end more, we still have to go through your other part. There's an agricultural water calculator that came out last year, and you can put in your address, and you can zoom through to your property, and you can put in a bunch of information about your crop, about the soil type, and what it does is it'll tell you how much approximate water it will take to irrigate the land. And so they've done it on a bunch of algorithms. So they take the sunshine hours, the precipitation, the evapotranspiration, the soil type, which is mapped in accordance to the provincial database. So that'll give you an estimate. And so we have some people that have had, used that so far. And there's also one on there for stock watering that I can show you in a few slides. So if, and I think where we run into this is if someone has just purchased the land and they've only owned it for a few years, and they say, okay, well, we've got some apples, and then we've got a few rows of vegetables and a hay field. We don't have any common ground. So we'll say, okay, here's the calculator, what do you think? And so at the end of the day, we need to land on a number, and it needs to be reasonable. And so when you look through all the typical water use records and the metering that happens in the province, there are some sort of happy mediums that you can land on, but it is really subject, like every Gulf island is going to be different, every soil type is going to be different, everywhere is going to be different. So that's why each water license application is unique, and that takes quite a bit of time to land on a number.
As you said earlier, though, nothing is static in farming. And,
No.
There have been years when I've gone a little bit crazy, and then I have health problems that have dropped way off.
Yeah.
And to come up, am I going to be stuck with that figure in the future? I mean, how the hell, who is measuring
Totally.
if I suddenly go way over what you've determined to be my annual usage? Do I end up paying for that?
So I don't determine your annual usage. Like when you apply for a water license application, you put in your annual usage.
But once you've established it, and I go over it, without even knowing I'm going over it, I'm just using the water on my land to irrigate my crops.
Yeah.
How the hell is the province supposed to know what my annual usage is?
Exactly, that's my question.
So
Pardon my language.
this is, how would you best describe this? So the province doesn't have people knocking on everyone's doors saying, how much water are you using? It's an honor system, that's the word I was looking for. No one knocks on my door saying, how much water are you using? At all. That absolutely doesn't happen. We're a complaints-driven system.
But you said an honor system, but you won't take our word for how much we're using, because quite frankly, in any year, I have no idea what that is.
And so we're not trying to take away anyone's water rights or anything like that. And so like
Well,
some of the
point?
applications in our office right now, we look at peak years and then low years. So if you have a very large harvest and a very large crop, and so then you'll use this much water, and then in other years, depending on your crop, you'll use this much water.
But how do we measure? How is anybody measuring?
So
Short of having a large irrigation pump which you're measuring and you know what you're using for the hour, I'm using trickle irrigation on everything I do.
Yeah.
And I have no idea of what's going through. And the only thing, I've stopped doing it out of a pond. I'm doing it out of a well, and the only limiting factor is how much that well is. It's a dug well.
So that's when clients have used the agricultural calculator, because you can put in your irrigation type in there, your irrigation system, whether or not it's drip, etc. And so it wasn't sort of just developed overnight. They did it in consultation with the BC Cattlemen's Association and a bunch of other agricultural groups. And so this is where I point clients towards it all the time.
I
And
guess
so,
I'm just trying to ask, what's the purpose of it all?
Taxes.
Short of a cash grab,
Taxes.
because they're not measuring anything. There's no way of calculating any of this, other than estimating. And again, it's a wildly fluctuating thing, depending on how much rainfall there is. There'll be years when I don't have to use hardly any
Yeah.
water at all, because it's raining so
Absolutely.
much. So what's the purpose of establishing a measure if there's no way of determining whether that measure is ever being exceeded, other than taking the annual minimum level? What's the point?
yeah, no.
What are we trying to accomplish here?
So I guess the best example that I could give is, let's say you have a lake. You have a bunch of people with pipes into a lake. And we say, okay, we think everyone in the lake is having a pipe go to their house, right?
We're talking wells here.
Yeah, so if everyone's on a well and they have a well going to their house, so then we're assuming that on average, that house is using 500 gallons per day.
Okay.
And so therefore, we're assuming that there's 500 gallons per day being diverted from the well. We're not assuming 5,000, we're not assuming 1, we're assuming the average of 500 gallons per day. And so if we're looking at an aquifer and there's 20 houses, and there's 20 wells, and each well is attached to the house, and we think that the well is going to the house and it's 500 gallons per day, we say 500 times 20, that's the amount that we think is coming out of the aquifer. And that's per day.
As you said, there is no aquifer here, but anyway.
Well,
I still don't see your point.
yeah.
Give somebody else a chance.
I'm sorry, but I still don't see the point.
Perhaps we could get through
Yeah.
the
Sure.
rest of the,
I have a
and
quick
if it's not
question.
answered, then it could.
Okay?
Quick question.
Yeah.
One more quick question, and then we'll.
Yeah?
Given even the example that you used, which you said was an extreme example to emphasize the point that water is supposedly cheap here, why is the minimum so high?
Question for revenue.
That's what we're.
Yeah. So that's and I can give everyone, we have contact numbers for Victoria for revenue, and if you take a business card, I can give it to you. That's their department, and they would be able to answer all those questions. Yeah, so I have a lot of business cards on the front. If you want to call me, I'll give you the number.
Okay, so
Okay.
let's take a
Keep
deep
going,
breath to
yeah.
finish the last slides, and then we can ask questions and spend our time and stretch and move
That was your
around.
last slide.
Okay, so that was the money slides, and I know they're controversial, they always are. Okay.
So will you tell us about ponds now, please?
Can we just very quickly go through this?
Oh,
We've
yes.
got a few
Okay, sorry, till we
examples.
finish. Sorry.
and
I
then
have
we
an
finish.
example with the pond in it.
Oh, sorry,
Yeah.
okay, thanks.
Okay. Okay, I'm gonna go quickly through this, and so we're gonna switch gears just a tiny bit. The groundwater protection regulation is one of the regulations. We've been talking about groundwater licensing and water usage and water rentals and fees and stuff. This is another regulation that's been around since 2004, so it's not new. It's changed a little bit, but it's not new. And what it does is regulates the wells and the individuals. This is where the drillers, ensuring that the drillers are qualified to drill your well. This is where they're registered. And I won't spend a lot of time on this, but we thought it was an opportunity because we're talking groundwater. And this is, so, we talked about exempted wells and not needing a license and needing a license. Regardless of whether you need a license or not, your well, if you drill a new well today, you need to make sure that you're meeting all the conditions of the groundwater protection regulation. And the easiest way to do that is to hire a qualified well driller, and then it's his responsibility to follow the regulation. And a lot of it is well, I said that it came into play in 2004, but it was best practices long before that. So the well construction standards that were put in 2004 in the reg, and they're tweaked a little bit now. Those have been around for a long, long time. It's just best practices, and they were just put in legislation. So we talked about the registration of drillers and well pump installers.
Alternative specs is if your well is, if you want your well to be slightly different from what the standards are, there is a way of doing that. Well construction requirements, that's when we get into a lot of things like the surface seal and the height of stick up of the well head, things like that. Well pump installation standards, there's some standards associated with that. Artesian flow, that's those flowing wells which can be quite well, one, they can deplete the aquifer if they're allowed to flow and uncontrolled and affect other users. They also can cause erosion of the ground surface if they're allowed to flow and are not controlled. And so there's some, and it's not, I know there's artesian wells artesian flowing wells on Salt Spring, but I'm not aware of any major problems. But there are some. There was a big case that's still ongoing in Vancouver, where somebody put a well in and it's been like millions of dollars later, and they still haven't solved all the problems with it. Well maintenance requirements. There's some requirements that you maintain your well as you go. And then deactivation and decommissioning these are holes in the ground. These are sources for contamination to go down. So there's some standards associated with that. And the well reporting requirements, we've been talking about the construction records. And there's also something called a closure report that you should be, when a well is closed, you should be reporting. Okay, next one. And as I say, since I won't go too much into that. This is the card you can ask for if you hire a driller. I'm not aware of any drillers that are drilling in this area that are not licensed. We know that there's a lot of excellent drillers on Vancouver Island that I know that also drill in the Gulf Islands, and then of course there's the local drillers like Albert Kay here, and Windecker is the guy on Gabriola. Okay, let's keep going. One of the new things that is in the new act is the separation distance. So before, there wasn't anything that had a set distance away that you had to be for another well, right? Regardless of what's on your property or not. So if the property line is here, you can't just drill right close to the property line. And what has happened in the past is people know that their neighbor has a really good well. Well, geez, what's the best thing to do? I'm going to drill really close because that increases my chances. So there's a 15 meter setback between two wells. If it's on your property, you can't put another well close to your original well, right? But if it's not, then it has to be at least 15 meter. And again, you need a professional to recommend and get approval to get a closer setback. Okay, so well pits. This is one of the new pieces. Well pits. Lots of wells, and I know there's lots on Salt Spring because we know from our quality study. Lots of wells were. There used to be an idea that the out of sight, out of mind. We'll put the well in a pit. We'll cover it off. We'll put we'll put a cap on it. We'll cover it with the garden and stuff. And the problem is situations like this where it's not drained properly. So a pit is not drained properly, and you can get water that's stagnant and that moves into the well and can cause contamination in your well. So it's around protecting your well from possible contamination. Now, having said that, you can still put a well pit. So there are wells in. I'll think back to Gabriola. There's a new little shopping plaza with restaurants and hairdresser and a store, and it's on one well, and the well is in the parking lot of the shopping center, and so it is in a pit, but it's drained, and there's protection around the top of it's sloped so that you're not going to get people wanting to drive over it because you'd have to kind of go over and pump it up. Not perfect. It's not a perfect situation, but it's possible to do. But there's a lot of these around, and they can cause problems in terms of the quality of the well.
And the water, if that well doesn't put out anymore, and you got all that stuff that's dropped down, it can take the aquifer out.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I didn't go into all of the details here, but one of the things that is in the construction standards that all wells must be capped, have a cap on it, and it sounds kind of trivial, but you wouldn't believe the number of wells that are basically open holes. And you know, we know cases where, well, there was a case actually, and it was on Salt Spring Island, where there was a development, a whole bunch of wells, and when the drillers didn't put caps on, so the wells were put in for a development, and the houses weren't constructed yet. When we went to, and so we got a complaint over one of the wells, but when we went to see the whole site, we found a whole bunch of other wells, and one of them had sticks of dynamite put in, and rope, and, you know, so it sounds like a crazy thing, but it's really not that expensive. A lot of people, what they'll do is they'll get the driller to weld the cap on, and then they'll take it off when they're ready to install the pump. But you know, you put your well in, you weld the cap on, and then you leave it. But then there's things like this. This is an example of a flowing well, but you'll see the cap on it is a sealed cap. There's an O-ring underneath that thing, and there's a whole bunch of bolts around it. And you can put a lock on it. Some places put a lock on it. Some people put a housing on it. Apparently in the States, these wellheads are nice target practice, and so you have to be careful because people want, you know, it's a target, right, for shooters. So flowing artesian wells are a problem. There's no question. They can be a huge problem, or they can be a minor problem. This is an example of a well that's flowing. You can see lots of water down here. And so this is one of the issues that the new act has tried to really tighten up on. Part of the problem with the flowing artesian wells, or the flowing wells in general, is that they're often put in by people not qualified drillers. It's by maybe like a heat exchange system, that, you know, like a subsurface heat pump system, and so the guy that's installing the heat pump system is drilling a well, and he says, oh, well, I'm not going to hit the water table, and then, oh, well, surprise, he hits the water table. He's not ready. He hasn't put the proper casing, hasn't started it properly, so he can't seal it up easily. And so they've tried to address it in a number of ways. One of them is in the qualified. There's a big issue in the interior. You know, I was on a field trip a number of years ago, and they had a well that was flowing, and they shut it off, and you could feel the whole thing shake, right? Because there was so much pressure. So you can get a lot of pressure from the subsurface. Okay, I won't talk too much about that. I just wanted to we often do like 2-hour talks just on the well construction stuff. So we just thought we'd mention it. Again, under control is some of the issues. You want the water to come up inside the casing because that can be controlled, as opposed to outside the casing. You can see this water pooling in here. Okay. You know, I guess this sounds self-explanatory, but you also don't want anybody to put contaminants or potential contaminants down a well. I have gotten calls from, I think it was Galliano a number of years ago, where there was 3 or 4 properties. They put a well on one property, and they didn't develop they didn't put houses. A number of years later, they were getting ready to and it was a big dug well, and a deer had fallen down, and so there was a deer carcass in the well. Oh, I know. So it's you know, so it does happen. It's a safety hazard. I mean, the dug wells especially are a public safety issue. If you're one of the women in the office was driving along in I think it was down in Saanich somewhere, driving along the road, and we talked about earlier about the wood. You know, I mentioned the wood around a dug well. This was on the side of the road. And she just saw this open little house, and she stopped out of curiosity. And what it was a dug well, which was big enough that a child could have jumped in it or fallen into it, or a pet. And it had the wood cribbing, no cap on it. So eventually it was closed, and you know, it was closed completely with cement. But it took us a while to get, and it was on a property that was being rented out, and the landlord wasn't around very much. And I've heard of another case where there was often some of these wells there's a piece of plywood or thin wood on top, and then it gets covered with leaves and stuff, and nobody sees it. And I've heard of a little dog just kind of jumping on it and getting in. So there's lots of issues, predominantly with the dug wells, and you know, in keeping them safe. Okay, next one. Okay, I'm going to mention saltwater intrusion, and I know we're running out of time, but you know, you can't come here to a Gulf island without recognizing that this is an issue, and we know it's an issue. And really, you know, it goes back to one of the original slides that I showed you, that the islands are, here's the fresh water, here's the seawater, and then there's this, you know, you put a well close to the shore, and you start pumping, and, you know, yes, you're going to pump the fresh water first, but as you continue to pump, you're going to start pumping the salt water. And that's how wells get impacted. And, you know, yes, this could happen naturally, you know, as the flow and stuff goes, but more often than not, it's due to over pumping at the foreshore, because obviously water is going to come at the path of least resistance, right? So you start pumping, it's going to pull. There's got this big source here, and a much more difficult source to tap into here. So as you continue to pump, you're going to pull it that way. And it's certainly an issue because once you, particularly in areas which are flat and don't have a lot of gradient, once the salt water comes in, it's very hard to pull it out and freshen up the well again. So that is, and it is against the Water Act to deal with, to pump salt water. That's a violation of the Act. Yeah, I don't think I'll spend much time on this. There are ways to minimize that risk, and the best way is through your drilling practices and then also on the operation of the well. And you can have a good well close to the foreshore if you start to, careful about how you pump it. You'll often hear people talk about sipping a well, and a well sipping, and what it does is you pump for a little bit, then you have the pump shut off. And so it's a managed system, right? And what you want to stay away from is what's an on-demand system, where the minute you turn the tap in the house, the pump goes and it just keeps pumping and pumping and pumping. And then if the tap gets left, and I have heard of cases on the Gulf Islands where somebody's here for the summer, they leave at the end of the summer and they leave an outdoor tap. And if it's connected to a well, that will go and go and go and go. Nothing's going to stop it, right, until the power goes out. Okay, so we've been talking about what this regulation is about. So what it is it's about protecting your well, your supply, which in turn protects the supply for everybody. And again, a lot of these are very simple and not that difficult to work with or to maintain. But I think they're so important, and so we just thought we'd take that as an opportunity to kind of look at some of the ways to protect your well. And I think some of these are fairly obvious: storing contaminants away from the wellhead, keeping a high stick up, at least a foot or 0.3 of a meter, so that when water and runoff comes, it's not going to go into the well. It's just going to flow around it. Most people will keep the ground sloped close to the well for the same reason: the water will run off. ID plate is new. Well, it's new. It's 10 years old. One of Faye's slides talked about an ID plate number and a well tag number. The ID plate is this metal plate that when you get your water license, if you don't already have one, you will get an ID plate. Water supply wells will, like the small improvement districts and the waterworks, will already have them, but probably the average homeowner won't. And what this does, it allows you to reference your well. You know exactly where your well is. And that sounds it might seem self-evident, but often when we get to a site to look at one well, we find 5. It's not, we always joke that, get ready to see more than one well, because time and time again, you go to find one well, and then it's hard to figure out which well is which, right? So that's why the ID plates are in place. And then the other was the well tag number. That's a numeric number that's generated by the database. So each well has a well tag number and a well ID plate number, and they're not necessarily the same. Well, actually, they're rarely the same. Okay.
Is annular space another word for corrosion or something?
Oh, sorry. Annular space is that when they drill the well and they break up the dirt, it's that space in between the metal casing and the ground.
Okay.
And so the way the regulation is written, you have to have a 15-foot surface seal of at least 1 inch in thickness around it. So what happens is usually the driller will drill an 8-inch hole through the overburden into the rock, and then he'll drill and then he'll put his 6-inch casing, and then he'll put his bentonite or grout around the outside of that to seal up that space, so that there's no chance of water, surf runoff going through, and that's obviously important, especially in agricultural properties, where if the runoff contains manure or whatever. The interesting thing on the Gulf Islands is, and so for a long time, people would just drill the well and then that was it. They didn't worry about the space at all, right? And there was a time, some people have had real problems with bacteria. They've sampled their well, they've gotten bacteria. The Walkerton issue in Ontario was partially due to that exact situation. But the interesting thing is, I remember talking to a few well owners on Gabriola, and what they said to me was that, yeah, we fixed up our annular space, but then we lost the yield in the well. Because what was happening was the water was coming in, and that's where the water was coming from. It wasn't coming strictly from the ground. So you got to be careful what you wish for. And then what some people will say to me, well, okay, I can treat for runoff, but I can't treat for low yield, right? I can always take the water and chlorinate it, or run it through UV or whatever, but I can't get more water than what it is. So yes.
Is that setback of 3 meters under the water the Water Act?
I believe so.
Because the Health Act and the Waste Management Act is a 15-meter setback from wellheads.
Yeah, I believe, to be honest with you, I think that's a best practice. That 3 meters away is a best practice, I think. In the sense, but there's definitely 100 feet rule, which is a health hazard.
Right.
And then there's other, and as part of that health hazard regulation, there's 100 foot is for potential sources like septic systems. I think pipelines are actually, I think you can be a little bit closer depending on whether it's a double walled or single walled pipeline. There's a bunch of rules. I'm sorry, I don't know the details of some of those.
Like manure storage guideline is.
Yeah.
Is a 15-meter setback.
Is it a 15-meter setback?
Under the waste management.
Okay. Yeah.
So this could be a practice. It says storage, but that would not apply to, say, manure storage.
No, yeah.
Or other.
But that's a good point, because this is not my slide, but I'm going to go look into that. I'll look into that too, because that's something that, yeah. I think where that's coming from is that very often people will have their wellhead and they'll build a little well house, and then they'll store their paint cans in the well house. It's like a shed, right? It's like a shed. So some jurisdictions, I think in Ontario, you're not allowed to put well houses anymore. I think they've outlawed the well houses, and they leave the wells like this one is. I mean, your pump would be, your pump's is usually down hole, right? Unless you have a shallow dug well, where you'd have your, yeah. And then the pressure tank, some people have the pressure tank right in the house, some people have it in the little hut, right? You might have, your wellhead, and then, and then the pressure tank right in the well, so it's not in the house, and so what comes to the house is from the pressure tank, so. That's a good point. I'll look into that, because actually I haven't seen that one before, and we also go by the 100 feet rule. Okay, we're into your examples,
2 examples and then we're done.
and then you can ask all your questions. Well, you ask them.
Okay, so these are hypothetical examples, but they're similar to 2 we just got in the office, but I changed the property and I changed the volumes and things like that. So as a decision maker, we can never be fettered, so a lot of people record these sessions, so just because we say one thing here doesn't mean it's going to translate exactly into the water license application, because every single application is different. So every application is different, but this is sort of a guideline. I'll show you guys. Next one. Okay, so this is a very straightforward application. So this is a vineyard. And we've got the house over here, and let's say grapes here, and then we've got a dugout or a large water body there. So we'll get this in the office. We haven't been on site yet, etc. So we're sort of going to ask some questions depending on what was filled out online. So there's 2 wells on the property. So well on the left-hand side here, it was drilled in 1959, And the applicant says that all the well water from this well goes directly to the house, so therefore it's domestic use. And as it's domestic use, just for the house, it's exempt, it doesn't need a water license application. So then we would talk with the landowner, is your well registered, do you want to have it registered, etc. It may already be registered in our eWells database, so if the driller at the time submitted any records, etc. So then we move on to the second well. So the second well was drilled in 1961 according to the information that was submitted in the application. So we say, okay, what are you using it for? Well, we're using it to water the vineyard. But we're also using some of that water to fill out this big dugout. So this black circle right here is a dugout that stores water. And so we would say, okay. And so the irrigation period would be as specified in the application, maybe April to September or whatever the applicant has put. They would specify a volume. And so with this well, the well was drilled in 1961, how this water license would look is that they would get a water license with a priority date of 1961. We would go through the application evidence that was submitted to establish beneficial use since 1961. So that would be a whole variety, number of things, depending on what the applicant has. And then we would also attach a storage license to this license, okay? So if the well was shut off, there would still be water in that dugout reservoir. So that's why we would attach a storage. So with the storage, we ask people to give us an approximate estimation of the length, width, and depth of their dugout. The last farm I was on, the person had spent $70,000 on their dugout. So they knew a lot about how much water it could hold. Other people do not spend that kind of money on their dugout. It really depends on what your water source is. So if this application came into the office and it didn't have a dugout, it would just be strictly irrigation, priority date of 1961 with an associated volume attached to it. The domestic well attached to the house wouldn't be licensed. So this is sort of how this would look, okay? As Pat said, there's always more wells, etc. So, questions about ponds?
Well, yes, I was just gonna say then, does that person have to pay a license for the pond and the well?
So this is one license with
Just
one
one.
priority date because they divert the water from the well into the pond. So the second question we always get in the office is, let's say there is no well.
Right,
Yeah. No well.
spring-fed pond.
No.
No,
Could
there's
be-
a-
Runoff pond.
There's a whole bunch of different
Yeah.
situations. So sort of in the Victoria Sandwich Peninsula area, we get a lot of ponds that are incised in what we find out is bedrock. So they're actually like fed from rainwater, and it, you know, you can't tell by pictures, you have to go to the person's property, etc. And so if it's a pond and it's not being fed by the water table or groundwater whatsoever, it's being fed strictly by surface water. We don't license rainwater, surface water, all that kind of stuff. So you have a big pond, surface water fed, no license. How do you determine if the pond is fed by groundwater? This is difficult. So there is no well, but you've got a pond on your property. So then we would pull up, so we would bring our hydrogeologists and we would look at the site and we would say, okay, what is the underlying rocks that we have here? So is it an unconsolidated? Is it hitting the water table? And then you would ask the applicant questions. So does this ever go dry? So if you have a drought for 4 months, does the pond always stay full? Well, if the pond always stays full during a drought, then it's probably accessing the water table. So there's a number of things that we can kind of go through to ascertain this. If it is intercepting the water table, then it's kind of in a sense viewed as a well or like a shallow dug well, so it's accessing the water table, and then it would be a licensable source. These are tricky and they're not the same, so every time an application comes in the office, we'll be probably going, all the ones we've had so far, we've always made site visits to talk with
Made
the
what?
applicant. Site visits.
I'm having trouble understanding why that farmer would want to register this well at all. I don't know what the size of the property is, but if it's, say, 5 acres or more, it's unlikely to be threatened by neighbours. And the nightmare that they're looking at in terms of registering this, I would think, would really discourage anybody from wanting to move ahead on this thing. So I appreciate that we're all wanting to protect our water, but there has to be some good reason for a farmer to want to do this. Next question, and I've got one after that, and then I'll shut up. What kind of enforcement process is being planned? And then, quite unrelated to that, but it's very much in all of our minds here on Salt Spring, rainwater catchment. Is there any consideration to trying to tax rainwater as well?
Okay, so I have those three in my head, but you'll have to remind me if I forget. So the first one would be, why would you apply for a groundwater license? So I think, again, so taking the government bureaucratic lens out of it, if I was this landowner and this was my vineyard, in British Columbia, water licenses are attached to land. So if you wanted to go sell this vineyard, you would need water to supply the vineyard. And you have that right now with your well. But to get a water license is formalizing that water right. So if your neighbor over here drilled a well in 1955, this well was drilled in 1961, and this well over here was drilled in 1955, and this area becomes under a drought, and let's say a compliance and enforcement officer came and knocked on the doors and said, okay, we need you guys to restrict your water rights. Well, 1955 might have registered the well and has a water license. If this vineyard owner doesn't have a water license, then they're not able to pump and divert water under the Water Act. And there are measures that compliance and enforcement officers can take to order basically cease and desist. Does that happen? How many times does that happen and play out on the ground? The example that I can give that happened 2 years ago was the Coldstream River in the Merritt area. It's a high salmon value river. And so, it's the hot summer, it hasn't rained, and, they're watching the Coldstream really, really closely in the Merritt area, and it's just going down and down and down. And so they went and assessed all of the surface water licenses that had pipes going into the river. And they said, okay, like we're going to lose high value salmon, it's in a drought. So they pulled all the water licenses, and they looked at all the priority dates. So they said, okay, well, it's a bunch of irrigators. It's a bunch of huge irrigation licenses that were on the Coldstream. And they said, okay, we have two options. We can go after everyone's fit first, so first in time, first in right, and say, you 1996 gets shut off first, and then 1990, and then the people are in 1961 hold their water rights. So that would be one option. So what they ended up doing is they went and knocked on everyone's door, all the irrigators, because they're all farmers that are neighbors with each other, and said, look, this is happening. What do you guys think about everyone doing a 30% reduction? So everyone agreed to that. They did a 30% reduction. The stream came back up in 2 days. So that's a real life example that happened in the province 2 years ago. I don't have any more tangible examples because as much as we talk about first in time, first in right, this hasn't been tested really actually too much. But we all sort of know climate change, drought, the way of the future. I anticipate in the next 50, 100 years we'll see more of this, or just even to look at California and what's happening there. So why would you want to get a water license? I guess as a business owner, it would secure your rights. Water rights are attached to a land. If you go sell a land, you have protection under the Water Act with your water rights. The second question, was that the compliance and enforcement? Who's knocking? Okay, so that question is, so we are complaints based. So, I mean, the reality is out in the sticks where government officers never get, people are doing all sorts of stuff. People build houses on Crown land and live there for 30 years. Goodness, all sorts of things happen, okay? What's wrong with that? So people divert water, they build dams, like there's all sorts of things that happen. I'm just trying to think of exactly how many compliance and enforcement officers we have in our region. I know it's between 15 and 20.
Oh yeah, if that, yeah.
If that, and that's for the entire Vancouver Island region, and they're dealing with not just water, they're dealing with a whole bunch of different acts. So it is a complaints-driven system. So a lot of times we're made aware of things happening because someone phones the office, and then we say, okay, like, do you have pictorial evidence, et cetera, and then we open a file. So just like the RAP line, report all poachers and polluters, that line. So we open a file into that line, and then we would have a water officer, a compliance and enforcement officer go out and see. How does this really play out on the ground? It does. We do have a number of C&E files open right now in our office. I had a C&E call yesterday that we're investigating. It's water. It's talked about. People notice things. The C&E file that came across my desk last week is about a client that wants to build a dam in a river, and the guy down here already has a dam. So, you know, consultants are running around taking measurements and they want this down to go, and it's like, whoa, 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 this is in a very remote area of the coast, so we have to get boots on the ground and get up there and see if there's a dam built. So people do talk. The reality is, do people go around and knock on everyone's doors and see that you're using the exact amount of water and on it goes? No.
But it wouldn't be tied into the BC assessment, and they are knocking on the door, and they are looking. And if you're
So-
claiming farm status, you're only getting a quarter-acre exemption if you don't register. So if you're farming your 5 acres, you better have a water license, or else you're not going to get your farm status.
So it is,
Unless
right?
it's rainwater.
You know,
there is a, so I can only operate under the jurisdiction of FLNRO. Like, I don't work for the Ministry of Agriculture or BC Cattlemen's or anything else, so I can only say, this is what we recommend. How other jurisdictions are gonna implement it, whether it's the realtor or whether it's the farm plan, etc., I have no control of that.
Quick question, I'm sorry.
And rainwater, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're just getting back to your pond, so you said if it was fed, if you could, it was obviously was fed by, so a spring-fed pond would qualify as a sort of quasi pump. Do creeks running through, is that groundwater? No, a year-round creek.
Yeah,
Is
so
it groundwater? And you
Surface
mentioned the
water.
clear water and
Surface.
people going in.
we would call it surface, so all the time, so what we usually see is that we usually see a creek going through someone's land and they put
Yeah.
a little weir on the creek and then they created a pond, like a storage, and that's a
Yeah.
surface water license with a storage.
So that's a different department.
No, that's our department, we do
That's your
surface and
department.
ground, yeah.
So could a person apply to pump water, say just at high water times, to top up a surface spring?
Yes,
You can do
and
that.
we have people that alternate between surface and groundwater,
Okay, thank you.
absolutely.
I just want to add, I just want to go back to this question of why would you do it? And I think you have to kind of look at it from the perspective that our job is to give you the information, this is the new act, this is the new law, so it is the law. And so it becomes a personal decision. It's just like getting a building permit, you know, you want to extend your dock and you have a decision whether to get a building permit or not. Well, the law is you have to get a building permit, right? But it's your personal decision whether you want to comply with the law or not comply with the law. And when you go to sell your property, it's just like when you put the suite is the other example, right? You put a secondary suite in your property. Well, if there's a bylaw or a law that goes with it, it's your personal decision whether you're going to follow the law or not. So I think we could spend hours and hours discussing the validity of this, or, you know, the decision was made to base the legislation on purpose, not on volume. And so, you know, we've been talking about this, it's why are you using the water is the cutoff, right? Not the volume. And so, yeah, I get it that some of these usages are very low volume, but that's not the way the law is set up. So I just want to kind of, you know, we could spend hours and hours debating the validity of the law or why it is the way it is, but it is what it is, right?
And
Don't look to my hands.
About the law, I'm old enough to remember when federal fisheries officers took Ministry of Forests employees under arrest to the Queen Charlotte City Cusco, and they spent the night there with a few loggers, because the federal fisheries guys were saying the provincial forest guys weren't complying with the federal laws. So my question is, on Salt Spring, where we're slowly changing, like we're losing more and more rain every summer, I see that. And I'm a member of the Island Streams and Salmon Enhancement Society, so I watch the stream flow in, let's say, Fulford Creek, which is one of the lowest, the summer flow rate, and that creek is going down and down and down. You guys have approved water licenses to pull water out of the creek in the last 2 years. How do you do that? Knowing that there's federal fisheries guys trying to keep the water up.
So, no, that's a very good question. So in our office, whenever we do surface water licenses, and this totally speaks to the compliance and enforcement piece. So when we do a surface water license, we have a policy called environmental flow thresholds. So environmental flow, so for that creek, we would have to look at the fisheries values. And then we would allocate to a certain environmental flow threshold. So you divide your hydrograph for 12 months of the year, and then you look at your fisheries windows as to when the months the fish are moving, and then you have to leave a certain amount of flow in the stream for environmental values, okay? Now that's gonna change every single year how much water is going down a river. Every single year that's different. So when we have to make a water licensing decision, we do it on a long-term average. So let's say a 10, 20, 30-year average of how much water is flowing down the creek. Understanding that some years may be higher, some years may be lower. So that water license would look at the long-term average. I didn't sign those ones off, so I can't say specifically what happened, but the process would be, is there enough water in January, in February, in March, and April that won't affect the ecosystems and the fisheries values? If there is enough water, then we would issue the water license. Part of the process is that we refer it to DFO, and they are objectors and they can state any concerns. That's how we know that there's fisheries values in there. We refer it to our ecosystems file, First Nations, landowners, everything. So then, if there is deemed enough water based upon the long-term average, we issue the water license. In the water license, we say, here's your annual diversion amount, but you cannot go above this maximum daily diversion. Okay, so we'll do the annual volume, but then we also place a daily diversion rate in there to maintain that environmental flow threshold. So then you give the license to the landowner.
But like was said earlier, you have no idea how much is actually being pulled out of that creek.
Exactly.
And actually, when they need that water for, let's say, olives, whatever it's,
Yeah.
that's being grown, that's when we need the water flow for,
Yeah.
for salmon as well.
So in those instances, so the desktop analysis that's done in the office, we're not allocating something into the red lines, but then you get on the ground and it's a drought year, there's no water. Well, if people keep pumping, that's not in accordance to what their license says. Their license says you must maintain, right? We don't guarantee the volume in a license. We say you can divert the water, but we don't guarantee the volume. And the license clause will actually state you need to maintain this level in the creek. If it goes below this level, you can't divert. We don't know what's happening on the ground. So through a complaints mechanism, so anyone using that stream doesn't like what's happening, can then phone our office and lodge a complaint, and then we can get compliance and enforcement and a water officer out there to take stock of what's happening. We will walk the stream, we will look at all the licenses, and we will do a review of the system. And if it's deemed, and we will have a DFO officer on site, and if it's deemed that, you know, it's over allocated, we will then take measures to do that. So again, we don't know what's happening at all ends of the earth, so we do rely on public complaints coming in. So for that situation, if there's an issue, we rely on a public complaint coming in, we open a file, and then we get people on the ground to go do an assessment of what's actually happening. We don't issue licenses unless DFO is involved, et cetera, et cetera. We do work in tandem with everyone. So I wanted to address the rainwater question as well, because a lot of the Gulf Islands have rainwater collection. A lot of people supplement it for their domestic use, various uses, et cetera. So in this situation, if you have your dug well next to your house and you're diverting water, but you also have a whole bunch of rainwater collection that subsidizes your house, that's great. You don't need a license for your house or anything like that. If you are using rainwater collection to subsidize, let's say, a small brewery or something else that's going on, so how that would affect your application is that you would basically just need to apply for a smaller volume that's diverted from your well. So the province hasn't gone yet to giving like discounted rental rates or anything like this, but you would typically apply for a smaller volume because then a portion of that is supplemented by rainwater. So if you said, okay, 1,000 gallons a day, but 500 is rainwater, then we would say, okay, the annual rental rate is for 500 gallons a day because that's how much you're using.
May I interject for one moment? There's currently a rainwater harvesting rebate program that CRD and Water Council have just initiated, and the deadline is the end of February, but we're hoping to push that. It's a first come, first serve. It's up to $2,500 on infrastructure or labor to install rainwater harvesting equipment, and you get $500 back. So 25% of a maximum of $2,500. So if you need more information about that, it's on the Watershed Protection Authority website.
Does that include ponds?
Yeah.
It's rainwater harvesting. That question would have to go to the person administrating the program. I believe that it might. It has to be anything that's collecting and holding rainwater.
So
Is that a question for me?
I've got a question about ponds.
Okay, yeah.
What if you don't use the pond? You have a pond, but you don't use it.
So water licensing goes back to that initial definition of beneficial use.
I'm sorry?
So the beneficial use definition that we talked about in one of the slides.
Yeah.
So water has to be used under a purpose and a volume and beneficially used. So if you have used the water for 10 years, but then you've stopped for 20, you've basically, how we view it is that you've lost the water right, because it needs to be used
So I can't
continuous.
use the water on my pond if I want to?
In terms of the water licensing, so you're more than welcome to use water in your pond on your property. In terms of a licensing regime, if your pond is filled up from, let's say, the dugout, we want to create that beneficial use history. So water has to be used beneficially, continuously. So, you know, we're not going to get into the splitting hairs if I didn't use it for 2 years or something like that. We're concerned about wells that have been capped, that haven't been used beneficially for 20 years. You know, these are the kind of things that we're concerned about. If someone hasn't used their well for a couple years and now they're bringing it online again, you know, those things we understand and we can work with. It's more if you have 2 wells and one well literally hasn't been used in 20 years. So there is no historical water right associated with the last 20 years because there's been no water coming out of the ground. So your water right would be associated when you actually start diverting it and using it. Does that make sense? Am I explaining that?
So just to clarify that, you're not saying you can't get a license to that
No.
well, but you're saying the time would be different. It's
Yes.
not 20 years ago, it's now.
Yeah,
So I
so,
think the question on the pond is, if you've got a pond on your property, we're not licensing ponds, we're licensing water use. So if you're not using your pond, and if it's just, you know, it's just on your property, a dugout on your property,
oh yeah, like
then
you're
it's
filling it
just a
with fish
dugout
and
on your
stuff.
property. It's
Yeah.
not, it doesn't
That's what
require
I
a
mean.
license.
Yeah, lots of
Yeah.
people fill it with fish or do all
Yeah,
sorts of stuff.
yeah,
That's fine.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah.
And can I just confirm, so if I dig a pond next month, let's say, and it's just for rainwater collection, and that's all that's in it, it just fills up with rainwater, that's of no interest to you, basically? There's no
Yeah.
license required,
Yeah.
et cetera? Okay.
Yeah.
So can you go in and amend the information you put in on your application? Or is it once in, that's it?
Once you hit submit, it goes into the front counter queue and it's locked in there. But as soon as a front counter officer gets it or a water officer gets it, we can amend lots of things. Because a lot of times we see that someone applied with 1 well, they say, you know, we really have 4. So then we'll add, you know, the other 3 wells, or they have 3 more ponds, and we're like, oh, okay, so then we add the 3 more ponds. So we have all the power to amend things. A lot of times we get different volumes, things like that. It depends on the
That
conversations.
you amend, but I'm talking about the farmer, the irrigator, whatever.
Yeah, you can call the office, absolutely. So you would call the front
They
counter.
can't access their own application and
You
know,
can
years
access
down the
it.
road because they've increased what they're doing and amend those,
Oh, I see. Like, are you talking quite a few years down the road?
That's an amendment.
or
So-
a year or whatever.
So, well, there is a certain time frame. So if you, let's say this 1961 license, so you have it, and then if 10 years down the road or 5 years down the road, you change your operation on your property and you start using more water, you would apply for a new water license application.
What if you change the source? Like
New-
from groundwater to surface water, would that be a new license as well?
New water license application, yeah, absolutely.
Problem with ponds is
Mhm.
the increased evaporation losses, water loss by evaporation,
Mhm.
and the increase the habitat temperatures the downstream.
Yes. In terms of what are we doing, or?
Just making a statement?
Oh,
I'm just
sorry.
making a statement.
Okay.
You didn't answer the rental house question yet. Whether you got
Okay.
that done.
Yes, I meant to bring that up. So the rental house question comes up often, and it's a tricky one. So, you know, if you look at the exact definition of commercial enterprise, the exact definition of commercial enterprise is that you're using your property or an entity, or you're deriving income from what you're doing. Okay, that's the definition of running an enterprise or a business, is that you're doing something to derive income. So if you have a house with basement suite, and it's a legal suite, and you claim the income on your taxes, that's a commercial enterprise. Are we looking to license every single house with a basement suite in it? No.
Not this year.
So, like, I can't even, yeah, like,
Yeah.
and that to me still falls under, like, so I've thought about this a lot because I get this question a lot. And then, you know, so you can read the legislation hard and fast and then you can say, okay, what's practical? So when I look at a household of an average of 4 people, if you split the house, so you have a top level and low level, I mean, we've all lived in upper and lower levels. You could have 3 or 4 people living upstairs, but a basement suite, sometimes it's 2 people, sometimes it's a family. It still, in my mind, falls within that domestic, like I'm not going around presentations saying if you have a basement suite, you have to apply for a ground